Okay, it's 2:30 my time and 3:30 in the East, and I want to welcome everybody to our Neuroscience and Education webinar for today. This is Betsy Hill, and I am President and Chief Operating Officer of the Brainware Company. We're delighted to have you all here with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping things as we get started. First of all, we will be recording our webinar today. So if you have colleagues or others that you think would be interested, or for those people who haven't been able to get on today, we'll make that available. It should be up in about a week or so, and we'll be sending out information on that when it's available. All the phones are muted except for our presenters. So if you have questions during the webinar, and we certainly encourage those, you can just type them, any questions or comments, into the chat window or the Q&A window, which were on the right side of your screen, but now that Sarah has shared with us the PowerPoint, it probably is at the top of your screen. So where it says you're viewing Brainware Webinars desktop, up in that area, if you move your cursor up there, you'll be able to access the chat window. I know there was a lot of interest in this webinar today, so please ask your questions. I don't know if we'll have a chance to get to all of them, but we will certainly try to get to as many as we can. Okay, I think that's it for housekeeping, and we can just go ahead and get started. Today we are very excited to have with us Tony and Jan Seahorn, who are authors of an amazing book called Tears of a Warrior. First, a little bit about Tony. Following his tour of duty in Vietnam, and then his subsequent physical therapy and recovery from combat wounds, he was informed by the Army that he would not be able to pursue his dream, which was to become a career aviator, because he had such extensive nerve damage to his arm and shoulder. His medals from combat include 2 Bronze Stars for heroism, 2 Purple Hearts, and a variety of other medals. Because he couldn't become a career pilot, he did have, though, a successful career in management at AT&T, graduated from college, earned an MBA, and he is joined today also by his wife, Jan, who has a PhD in Human Development and Organizational Systems. She teaches neuroscience and literacy at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. She has an in-depth understanding of neuroscience research, including learning and memory, the effects of at-risk environments on brain development, and also research-based instructional practices. There is so much more I could tell you about these 2 extraordinary people, but I think we'll just go ahead and get started, and I'm going to let them tell their stories, which I think you will really find quite remarkable. So welcome, Tony and Jan.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having us.
It's good being here.
Oh, good. That's great. So, Tony, let's start with you. I was so struck by the title of the book and the way that you talk about the concept of a warrior, and you were obviously the warrior of your book title. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your life, how you got into military service, about your Vietnam experience, and how it ended. And then we have a few pictures that you've shared with us, which Sarah will sort of scroll through and show as you talk about it.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And as the pictures come up during my explanation, then I'll try to give you a little bit of background or detail on the photo. The photo you're looking at right here was obviously when I was a young Army officer in Vietnam with an orphan. We had an orphanage at our base camp, and when I arrived in early 1968, we had probably about 15 Vietnamese orphans, and when I left there, I think the number was something like 75 to 100, and of course to this day I don't really know what happened to those orphans. Some of them I know were evacuated, and others probably stayed within the country. But back to your original question, my background, I grew up in Wyoming. Very patriotic family. My dad was a veteran of World War II. In fact, he served in the Normandy invasion. And then I had a couple of uncles who served in Korea, and one younger uncle who also served in Vietnam pretty much during the same time frame that I was there in 1968. As far as growing up, I was probably the typical all-American boy. I loved sports. I did relatively well in school, but it seemed that, the sports kind of kept me going. And growing up in a small town in Wyoming, I was involved in all aspects of the school environment, from almost all sports offered to, other extracurricular activities. But I ended up going to college at the University of Wyoming, and not really sure back then what I wanted to do. I ended up in the field of aeronautical engineering. That was primarily because I had a couple of friends 2 years ahead of me who thought that was a great field because that was their course of study. So I went to the University of Wyoming for 2 years, and basically two things happened at the end of my sophomore year. Probably most importantly is I ran out of funding, and I pretty well was self-funded for college. And then secondly, I still was somewhat disillusioned as to what I wanted to really do with my college career, if you will. So I went and talked to an Air Force recruiter. I explained to the recruiter how much I wanted to get into the Air Force, and hopefully with all the right action and courses, I could become an Air Force pilot. So I dropped out of college. The situation with the Air Force was such that at that time it took about 3 months before you would have your induction into the Air Force, and that was primarily because there was quite the waiting list to get into the Air Force as opposed to the Army or the Marines or even the Navy back then. So I dropped out of college and kind of went back to work. Within a couple of weeks, Uncle Sam's Army sent me a draft notice. We all knew back then, with the draft, with the Vietnam War, that you definitely didn't want to just drop out of college. You wanted to maintain fairly good grades, and you wanted to stay in school. Well, I had a plan. Of course, my plan was to go in the Air Force. Well, I told the Army that I already had an induction date for the Air Force, so not to worry about my serving my country. The Army proceeded to inform me that they took precedence over, the draft took precedence over my induction, and especially since my induction was 3 months out. So after much argument back and forth and my trying to explain to the U.S. government how things should really work, I was drafted into the Army. So I ended up going through basic training and AIT, which is Advanced Individual Training, and became an E5, what we call then buck sergeant. I specialized in demolitions. And one day, my drill sergeant came up to me and said, Tony, you continue to talk around the base, around with your comrades, if you will, about your love of flying, and said, have you ever considered going to OCS, Officer Candidate School? And I said, well, no, I really haven't. Tell me more. I think I'm just going to put my 3 years in the Army and get out. He says, well, there's still an opportunity to fly. The opportunity would be in the Army and not in the Air Force. And I said, really? How do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to get your commission. And the best way for you to get your commission, since you're already in the Army, would be to go through Officer Candidate School. So I did go through Officer Candidate School and made it through that program. And then after that, I qualified for the Career Officer program, and I went through that, and then also went through the basic preliminary certification of helicopter school. So no sooner did I finish that, and I received orders to go to Vietnam. The slide that now is up on the screen is the photo I took in Vietnam. When I got over there, I didn't know what unit I'd be assigned to, and even though I tried to get into an aviation unit, My MOS, my military background, was combat communications officer and also rotary helicopters. I was told that a young battalion communications officer with the Black Lions of the 1st Infantry had just been killed in combat, and that the division was in critical need of a replacement. So my duty assignment was with the Black Lions of the 1st Infantry Division. Most of the time I was in Vietnam, we would fly into remote areas, make contact with the enemy, and then our plan was to hopefully withdraw and then call in airstrikes and artillery support. This photo right here is a new fire support base, and what we're doing is popping smoke so that the other subsequent helicopters will know where to come and land and drop off the troops. We were there less than 3 days and made contact with the enemy. And later, as we looked at the numbers that overran our position, we were 160 strong in the field. That's 160 men. We were overrun by a division that was estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 NVA. They were on their way to Saigon trying to infiltrate that part of South Vietnam, and they just literally ran over us and through us. But throughout all of that, some of us did survive. About 20% either weren't killed and wounded of my battalion light unit. So the next slide will show you the aftermath of this same pristine area 5 days later. And, you know, this is what I would call the horrors of war. I mean, the destruction that goes along with it. This certainly depicts the destruction of a triple canopy jungle and what it looks like after airstrikes, B-52 bomb strikes, and then, of course, all of the mortars and ground combat. But, you know, helicopters are down, troops are wounded or killed, and then, of course, you know, once you've disconnected from the enemy, then you load up and you move on to another area. So this is the aftermath of 5 days along the Cambodian border.
But this wasn't the first incident, Tony, was it? You'd had some previous pretty violent experiences, as I understood from your book.
Right. Most of my almost 11 months in Vietnam were spent on missions very similar to this. An infantry unit cannot function without communications, and of course my role as a young Army lieutenant and my company's role, the men I had with me supporting communications, are right there with the infantry. I mean, we're on the ground. I oftentimes would be in the air in a helicopter because sometimes you only have what we call line of sight communication. You can't communicate from the ground, but if you elevate yourself, and a helicopter would be a good example, then you can communicate back with your air support, your fire support, and also with the ground troops. So oftentimes I had to go up in a helicopter to sustain communications. But yeah, we would go from one mission to the next. In fact, of the 11 months I was there, typically 3 months of duty in combat, and you get an R&R. You get to go to Hawaii or Bangkok or Hong Kong or Sydney, Australia, and just chill out for 3 days to a week. And every time I was scheduled to go somewhere, we had another mission on the docket, and I'd cancel my R&R, and off we would go again into a combat environment. So I never did take an R&R the whole tour I was in Vietnam. As far as
we've got
this particular slide, I mean, this is very typical of what we experienced in Vietnam. Is, you know, you need to honor the fallen, and of course this depicts the number that we would lose on, you know, any given day and any given conflict. This is just a particular day. The helmet on top of the M16 rifle in the boot. just to remember those who we had served with and we had lost in combat. And then the next day or the next week may not look any different.
So eventually, it was time for you to come home, and you did, although maybe not entirely intact physically and certainly emotionally. Tell us a little bit about your what brought you home.
Okay, I was wounded twice. Once I was wounded in the leg in country, and I recovered from that and went back to duty. But the second time was another time that we were on Operation Junction City. Once again, made contact with the North Vietnamese. Our position was just totally overrun. We were just literally outmanned, and that was very typical of the Vietnam War, especially beyond the Viet Cong, who we were originally fighting. When the North Vietnamese Regular Army got involved, we were no longer talking about a guerrilla war. We were talking about a massive invasion from China and North Vietnam down into the south, and these were well-trained troops, and they weren't just clustered in various places like the Viet Cong. They came down literally by the thousands, and oftentimes they moved as an entire division or a regiment, and you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4,000 troops. So that's what we encountered. Our position was overrun at Junction City, and in that initial firefight, I was shot twice in the right arm, and I had shrapnel wounds to the chest and once again in my leg. But I wasn't evacuated for about 12 hours, so I had a tourniquet on my right arm, and we continued to be, and much of the time, hand-to-hand combat. And there was the enemy is very calculated in when they attack. And that particular night, we had real heavy fog. It turned into rain, and that was an ideal time because it's hard to see, and you can't call in air support because they can't see either. So it's an opportune time for the enemy to attack. So it took about 12 hours to be evacuated, and when I got to the military hospital in Long Binh outside of Saigon, I was unconscious. I had lost so much blood, and the next thing I knew was 4 days later I woke up and I was in a U.S. Naval hospital outside of Tokyo, Japan. From there, I was stabilized for almost a month, and then was assigned to a military hospital as close to home as possible. In my case, that was Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver. And as far as the recovery, I was in and out of Fitzsimmons a little more than a year. I was bedside for about 6 months, and then after that it was a lot of physical therapy and physical rehab. And of course, at that time, my feeling was, if only I can recover from the physical wounds of war, I can get on with my life. And of course, little did I know, and little did anyone know about the long-lasting effect of the emotional aspects of war. Once again, I thought most of us who went to Vietnam, and especially before we went to Vietnam, we thought we were young and invincible, and of course, how quickly that changed. But I still couldn't understand the emotions that I started experiencing, and the nightmares and the flashbacks and the panic attacks and the anxiety and the rapid heartbeat. All of those things I just could not understand, because my whole focus and attention was on trying to recover from the physical wounds of war. So when this thing,
so you were having those kinds of reactions from the very beginning, from the time that you basically woke up, and understood your wounds and were trying to recover. So you were having those emotional experiences all along then?
Yes and no, and the way I'll answer that very briefly is, when I was in the hospital, not only had I had a lot of blood transfusions and they had me on a lot of medication, I was on Darvon for a long time, and that really, did a number on me because they finally took me off of it, and it's kind of like being on any heavy drug. Was I kind of went into what do you call it, a relapse or
withdrawal.
I could not handle being off of pain meds and drugs that kind of kept me in a good place. So when the medical staff took me off the medication, I really started having a lot of problems. That's when the nightmares and all that started coming out. But, you know, after my system kind of recovered from being weaned of the drugs and all of that, then I pretty well returned to normal. And I was told in the hospital that, you know, this too will pass. So even the emotions I was feeling and all of that did get better towards the end of my hospital stay. And to answer your question, it was probably 2 to 3 years later before it really hit me again. And when it hit me then, I thought my world was coming to an end. I mean, it was more severe and had more impact than I ever experienced when I was in the hospital.
Wow. So maybe we could turn to Jan now, and because as I understand it, you met Tony not long after he returned from Vietnam, and while you knew he had served in the military, you also talk in the book about not really knowing that much about his experiences. So maybe you could share with us a little bit about how you met Tony and how you first started then at some point to become aware of issues even before you knew that it was PTSD, since that term didn't even exist at the time.
To start out, I met Tony in Denver. He had just gotten out of the service, and he was starting his career with what at that time was General Electric. And I met him. He was one of his friends was staying at the apartment house that I was at, beginning my first year of teaching. Met Tony at that point in time. We started dating, but then at the time we were dating, you don't notice these things because we didn't spend that much time together like couples do now. So after we got married, probably about 3 or 4 months after we got married, what was happening was that one night especially, he woke up, his real first severe nightmare occurred, and he was screaming, "They're coming over the fence." Now what was happening, which I didn't know at the time, he was reliving that last combat experience that he just described to you, and he was screaming, "They're coming over the fence, fight." And then he woke up. What happened before he woke up, he slammed me in the chest really hard. For some reason, I was smart enough not to try to wake him up, and I just calmly crawled out of bed and sat in the corner the rest of the night. When he finally got up, he was sweating profusely. He went into the bathroom to check himself, and when he came back, he said, "Why am I in the corner?" And when I tried to explain to him what had happened, he goes, "I didn't do that." And I'm saying, "Yeah, you did," and he had no recollection of it. What we didn't know until almost 25 years later was when he was going into the bathroom, what he was doing was checking himself to see if he was covered in blood and all the fuel that was from downed helicopters. Had no idea that was what was happening, and the horror of that. He never talked about it. What happens historically, though, it's only been since 1980, in the mid-'80s, that they started talking about post-traumatic stress. Until then, it didn't even have a name, so we didn't have language to discuss it. There was no way to frame it. The other thing is that you look at all the warriors that came back, World War II, World War I, Korea, and no one ever spoke of that. People came back. They seemed to integrate into life as much as the stories that we could hear from them, and nobody discussed it. Well, when we actually started knowing about post-traumatic stress, we started researching, and they said anyone in World War II that had 60 days of combat or more, 98% of them had severe PTSD, and the 2%, maybe they said, might have been psychopaths. The other issues that we had that I noticed that was coming up is that he seemed to always need to be in control. He needed to sit by the door. He had to be facing the doors or the windows, so we needed to, and I didn't know it was an escape mechanism. If things. If we went on a ski trip with the children when they were little, he needed to be 100% on time, like not even 5 minutes late, or he would really be very upset and anxious. We had no idea why that was happening, but it was his need to control. Because in combat, if you're not on time, if your tools, if your rifles, if your guns are not in impeccable condition, people died. Well, we had no clue. We were just a family trying to go on a ski trip. When we were on vacations, I would say every other vacation we ever took, we would end up in an emergency room because we thought he was having a heart attack. What they were panic attacks. So there were all of these issues that came up, these behaviors that we did not associate with post-traumatic stress until we started knowing a little more about it.
If I might interject and to kind of add to what Jan has said here, I was basically diagnosed by the medical profession, and we even had an on-site medical staff at AT&T. But I was diagnosed with work stress. The feeling was that work was too stressful. I was too integrated into that process, and I just needed to chill out a little bit, maybe take a little more vacation. And so it was always like your work stress is causing these other problems. The other comment I wanted to make was in previous wars, when we talk about, today we talk about post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder. In previous wars, it was often identified as shell shock or combat fatigue, and what most felt and believed back in previous wars was that eventually it was something that would pass and you would get over it. So as we have written the book and done a lot more research, and as we all as a society now better understand post-traumatic stress, we realize that it's been around forever. It's just that it was identified differently, and of course, prior to fairly recent times, people didn't talk about it.
Seems pretty remarkable that somebody would look at the experiences, and maybe it's our perspective today because we do know a little bit more about it, but to look at the experiences that you had in the workplace compared to the experiences you'd had at war and blame it on work. It seems pretty crazy that somebody wouldn't have taken that other that previous experience into consideration. Not that work can't be stressful, but
that's probably true. And keep in mind too, I didn't spend a lot of time pursuing it. In other words, if a doctor tells me, Tony, I think you're too stressed out as a result of your work, they talk to you things about, well, how's your marriage? My marriage is fine. How's your family life? Well, it's fine. So the only thing it really could be was the hours I was putting in at work and the pressure I was under to, meet timelines and stuff. And that was then causing maybe some of my dreams, my nightmares, my combat experience, which they were aware of, to come out. But they felt that work was the trigger that was bringing this out. Little, did they know, and like I said, I didn't pursue it with a lot of different professionals, but little did they know that wasn't really true at all. And I just kind of accepted that as it must be that, but it never really went away.
Sure. So maybe we could talk. You've talked about some of the symptoms and signs that you experienced: the panic attacks, the need for control, the nightmares, and things like that. Maybe you could also share. I mean, are those the most prevalent symptoms, or the most common symptoms, or are there other things that people should be aware of if they're have, either themselves been through these kinds of traumatic experiences or have loved ones who have done that? What would be the symptoms that you would point to?
Yeah, I would say that from my perspective, based on my experience, and of course, we're human, and many of us are different in the way we react to situations, but I can say that for most of my life, and ever since I started experiencing post-traumatic stress, and it's been, 35 years or whatever the count is now, most people did not see anything outwardly that would suggest that I had anything wrong. In fact, I had a successful career. Oftentimes I would be dying inside, but I didn't allow that to be outwardly shown or projected in any way. And of course, I didn't want to be perceived as weak or not have the ability to lead, or that I didn't have command and self-control. So I did a wonderful job most of my career and most of my, well, I won't say my family life, because Jan's going to tell you a little different twist there, because that's really where it would come out. But most people never knew there was anything wrong with me because I didn't show it and I didn't talk about it. Our family life, 95% of our family life was happy. I mean, we traveled. The kids got exposed to our interests. We started them skiing early and swimming early, 4 or 5 years old. That we went camping. We vacationed to wonderful places. And so the majority of our family life was a wonderful family life. But the other side, the downside is when I would lose my cool or I'd get overly anxious and I became real short with Jan or the family, then that kind of ruins the other 90% of goodness, because it's that rotten apple that ruins the rest of it. And so even though my perspective was my outbursts and stuff are just a minor part of our relationship, what they really do is they taint the whole relationship. And I think, Jan could better depict or elaborate on that, but I basically felt there was really no problem even at home, because when I did have issues, they came and they went, and now life's fine again. So Jan has a little different perspective.
Well, it's Daniel Siegel talks a lot about children and attachment disorder, and the worst attachment model that he has is ones of inconsistency, where you just don't know what to expect. So yes, 90% of the time things were great, but you always knew, it's that survival mechanism of fight or flight. You always knew that some point down the road something was going to show up again. You didn't know when, you didn't know how it would show up, you just knew that it would show up. And so as a family, you're always on high alert, so you have your own then post-traumatic stress issues of anxiety and alertness, because you know it's going to happen. You just don't know when. That's why we have, the broken relationships, because it's unpredictable. I know that a lot of times either one of the spouse, but a lot of times the vets will just get up and leave the relationship because they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to explain it. That's happening a lot, from what I understand, with Iraq and Afghanistan vets. And they have this honeymoon period when they get back. So it might take 1 or 2 years, and then all of a sudden they leave because they either can't talk about it, they won't talk about it, they don't want any. A lot of them will say, I just don't want my loved ones and families to know how awful it was and everything that I did and had to do. So it's pretty tough. We also want to state up front that vets really make amazing work people. They make amazing employees. Most of the time, it does not come out in the workplace. It comes out on downtime, which is family time.
And I might also add, I've really had a good support system in Jan and my family, and I basically had good support at work. In other words, I worked for good management, and I was always relatively happy in my career. A lot of veterans don't have that. They don't have the job opportunities. They may not have a relationship that was as good as our relationship, because we know that a lot of veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress have multiple divorces, unemployment, drinking and drugs, homelessness. I mean, it kind of goes on and on. So there's, depending on your support system, what you're able to immerse yourself in has a lot to do with how you move forward. And I think I was very lucky and have been very blessed with my support system, even when I was struggling and didn't know what to do, and we didn't even know what we were dealing with. I still didn't have people running away from me. And I know in many cases, veterans who are really struggling today don't have the same support system.
Right. Well, I think it's important that we'll start talking shortly about the recovery process and the things that you and other vets have found to be effective. But first of all, I'd like to ask Jan, because Jan, you do a lot of work on understanding and teaching others about neuroscience, and it looks like there are a couple more things that should be up there. Yeah, there you go. Sorry, you had back one. Obviously you had them animated, and I didn't quite get that figured out. So we're looking at some of the main parts of the brain as if we were looking at them from the right side. So the eyes would be on the right, and the back of the head would be on the left. So could you, Jan, just give us a little bit of background on those parts of the brain and what changes or is going on them if the brain is affected by post-traumatic stress?
Okay, so this is highly simplistic just for people to know, but the key that we're changing, we're trying to get away from post-traumatic stress disorder. Now a lot of medical people are calling it an injury. I really don't even like to call it an injury. I like to call it, put an R at the end, a reordering of the brain. What we know, and I always talk to my students about this, first thing I talk to them about is experience sculpts the brain. It starts in utero and it continues until you die. So every experience you have, no matter what it is, good or bad, it's changing your brain to some degree. Trauma changes the brain very quickly, and it sometimes can be a fairly significant change. And what happens with all of our experience, it comes to us only through our senses, our sights, our smells, our touch, our taste, all of our senses comes up through the brainstem. So that lower part, that brainstem part of the brain, is where we have our fight or flight, our survival mechanisms, our breathing, our automatic nervous system. It's coming into that brainstem. When we have and experience trauma, what happens in the brain is that, and the brain is so amazing when we are in that survival mechanism, in that huge trauma, we're really in that fight or flight mode. It basically turns off that prefrontal, that very front part on the right side, that prefrontal cortex, our planning, our executive functions, our thoughtfulness, our consciousness, really, that we are intent, our intentions come from that prefrontal cortex. Well, in survival mode, that's turned off. You go into an automatic system. Your breathing increases because you need more oxygen and more blood flow. And basically, that blood flow is not going to that prefrontal cortex. It's going to the hands and the legs and your extremities so you can fight or you can run really fast. So the digestion gets shut down. Basically, the only thing the brain is doing is shutting down everything except what is going to be needed to keep you safe. The problem with that is that once that trauma is there, for human beings, for animals, it's very different. They experience that, but after the trauma, they kind of brush it off. The cortisone, the adrenaline gets released from the body, and they shake it off. For humans, is what happens is it goes into our subconscious, and when we have anything the sight, the smell, touch, taste, any of those experience that are similar, even though we're in a different situation, remind us of that terrible experience, they get turned on again, and we go right back to it as though it's happening in real time, and it could have happened like Tony's 40 years ago. It affects kids. Anyone who's been through severe trauma, their brain is set up on usually more of a high alert anxiety, and that is to keep them in surviving on this earth.
Right. So basically, because all those parts of the brain have experienced those earlier events, that when something triggers something that is similar to those earlier events, it has the same result in the brain, so that everything just shuts down and you get that panic or that anger or that just sort of shutting down and fight or flight.
Right, and until you can slow the brain down, slow your breathing down, do some coping mechanisms, become more aware of what's happening, that is going to continue. That's why, different therapies, different medications that they keep trying out to see what we can do to get the person back into real time, into that prefrontal logical thinking mode, and that's what our healing's about and our therapy's about.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to healing and therapy and recovery and the kinds of things you just talked about. Some drugs that are often prescribed and may play a role, and you've talked about some other things. So could you share with us what I think we can go to a different slide, Sarah, the one that says getting back to home. Yeah, that'd be great. So what are things that are helpful? What did you find helpful, Tony? What have you heard from other vets that has really helped you with that recovery process?
Well, the biggest recovery for me occurred in the mid 1990s. The University of Colorado Medical Center put an ad in the Denver Post, and they were looking for Vietnam veterans who had experienced, combat stress or post-traumatic stress, whatever we called it in the mid-90s. But I think we were starting to use PTSD as a term then. And I saw the ad in the paper, and I went ahead and applied. I wanted to at least go in and interview and find out what the study was all about. As it turned out, the study was being conducted by doctors and nurses, therapists, all of whom were Vietnam veterans. And that's the first time this light came on, and I really had the opportunity to open up and communicate with anyone about what I was continuing to experience and what had gone on in my life. That was a 2-year study, and I was accepted into the program. I think there were 12 of us, and those in the program were anywhere from almost dysfunctional to those that seemed to be relatively normal, and I kind of fit into that normal category. Obviously, once we got into the discussions and all the issues, then I was a long ways from normal. But what we did is there was a lot of therapy, there was a lot of medications, and there was a lot of practice of meditation and relaxation techniques. And essentially, what I experienced there was what I continue to experience to this day. Is after that I got enrolled back with the VA, was assigned a counselor, and after going through a couple different counselors, finally found someone that I was compatible with. And we've essentially continued along that road of recovery, of therapy, having discussions, talk therapy, certain medications, a little trial and error, because once again we're all human and we're all potentially a little different. Some medications that work for me don't work for other veterans with PTSD and vice versa. And then relaxation techniques. And relaxation techniques can be whatever works for you. It could be in your home. For me, it's in the outdoors. Jan and I are both fly fishermen. We love to be on the river. We love to be with our lab retrievers. We love to be with our sons. And just that quiet place in nature is really comforting for me, and I think it just helps overall. Other veterans, very similar, but it's not, there isn't a particular format or solution, one size fits all. We all have to kind of work through what our issues are, what our support system is, and then, what's available. There's various other techniques out there that I know that have worked for some of which I've tried and they haven't worked for me, and one of them is called EMDR, which is eye-hand movement?
Eye movement reorganization.
Yeah. But anyway, I talked to some veterans who just said, hey, boy, this is the solution, and I went through it, and I hung in there for about a year, and I just didn't feel it was doing anything to help me. And the studies say that, only X% really benefit from, some of these various techniques, whether it's hypnosis or whatever it might be. But I think the other thing that has helped me quite a bit, and, we've often been asked if writing this book was cathartic for me in any way or a relationship, but I suppose it was, but I have found that the more I can talk about it and be open about it, it's probably good for me, but the thought that we are in some way giving back and helping others is probably one of the most important things in the healing process. When you can kind of live outside of yourself and you're not so focused on yourself, but rather on, the well-being and the healing of others, has helped immensely. And I tell a lot of veterans that we meet with who are suffering from PTSD, if there's any way they can move beyond their own self-focus, not to avoid it or hide from it, but as you start the healing process, you're doing your medications, you're doing your therapy, you're doing all the things that help you relax. And then one of the final steps is giving, beyond yourself. It really does help the healing process.
And also that
go ahead.
That any kind of exercise for anybody, so this isn't just someone who's experienced trauma, but exercise is really critical. Also, watching what you eat, looking at your diet, what goes into your body, and is important, because a good diet really helps avoid some of the issues, especially around anxiety and depression. The not self-medicating is, if I would say, one of the biggest things that kills a relationship is when any party tries to self-medicate for any reason, because when you're in that state, you already have taken out any type of communication or reasoning. So watching that, I know a lot of people will say, I'm not good at meditation, and I would probably be somewhat in that category until I heard an African saying that said, when you walk, pray. And so when I'm doing my best meditation is when I'm in the outdoors and I'm walking and I'm doing something else. But I think for me that's I need to be active. I don't sit still very well, and Tony doesn't either. Having a pet, I know that whether he's a service dog like Tony has, just having that other living thing around you to be, so you're not isolated, you're not alone, is hugely comforting and can make a huge difference.
Oh, there are lots of options. It sounds like the message is there are a variety of things. If one doesn't work, another one may. Don't give up on it, and that there's a lot of different approaches to that. I'd like to spend a few minutes, Jan, taking advantage of your experience as a teacher and as an educator to take a look at children and post-traumatic stress. We're hearing more about that, and I think that there are a lot of teachers who realize that there are students that they may have in their classrooms that struggle with this, or who have families who are struggling with this. And you've talked a little bit about, I don't think we have time to talk about all of this, but maybe we could talk about the kinds of things that would help students. You've talked about some of the things that were beneficial for Tony in his recovery and his managing his issues. What can teachers do? What can educators do to understand and support the students in their lives that may be affected by post-traumatic stress?
I think one of the big things is, that teachers need to understand, if a child has undergone that trauma, especially before the age of 3, that is a pre-verbal stage, so they don't have language. The brain doesn't start really holding memories into long-term memories and into a conscious memory system. So the experiences, the trauma is still there. It's just that that pre-verbal stage can make it more difficult for the child to talk about it, and even for diagnosis. For teachers especially, stay out of the blame game. They may put a label on a child without ever knowing what this child has gone through. They might think that he's lazy, he's violent or whatever, but those behaviors come from somewhere. And those somewheres are experiences that happen to that child, and that child's behavior is just an indicator that something is not right, and that child, at least at that time, is not feeling safe. So I think for educators, it's establishing that sense of trust, establishing a safe environment for that child to be living in while they're at least at school is absolutely essential. And you can't do that if you're judging that child and you don't have enough good information to make those judgments.
Are there different things that you would recommend for young children versus middle school or high school age students?
I think for young children and even others, teachers aren't generally trained in this, so getting hold of a counselor or a professional that's really trained in trauma and not just diagnosing trauma but recognizing trauma, it's really hard to do some of these things without that expert being with you and supporting you in your journey with the child. I think with little kids, giving them play situations where they might be able to talk about what's happened to them or what's going on with them, or having them draw a picture and talk about it. I just caution teachers to be careful about doing that without having someone there to guide them, because they may get into a situation where that child loses it totally and they won't know how to react or what to do to bring the child down and get them back to breathing carefully or at a normal level and calming that child down. In fact, the teacher may actually add to the problem. So adolescents and high school teachers, even little small children, I really like to teach them about the brain. The more they can know about their own brain and not take it as something's wrong with them, but that this action, this behavior is happening to them, and now we can help learn that slide before that talked about changing the brain is skill-based, learning new behaviors. You have to practice that new way of thinking, that new way of acting, even with stress. One of the new techniques for stress is reframing it so we don't do the, oh my gosh, isn't this awful, but that this has happened, I'm strong, I can be in control, and doing some self-talk on how we reframe the situation and how we look at it from other viewpoints and perspectives that does give us a feeling of more control and understanding. And that's at any age. And the brain, understanding more about the brain, I think helps kids put language to it, helps them put reasons to it, and helps them then be able to move beyond it to do more of practice the new way of thinking and acting.
Mm-hmm. So if you, for example, and I think you made a couple of really important points there, which one is about the support system. And Tony talked before about the system of support that he had, both within the family and otherwise. And it's not, the load isn't on the teacher. That it's important to recruit the support system and make sure that you pull in as many resources as you can who have experience and can help with this. And then what I just heard also is that if you know that the child is working on this and practicing new ways of thinking, that's something that can really be supported by a teacher or a counselor, where you can help them make sure that they have the time and space to practice that reordering, if you want to put it that way, practice that different way of thinking or framing it. I guess that was the term that you used.
Right, and knowing and giving, even like with Tony, but children, to let them know you're not going to be perfect, And so at least when something goes a little bit backwards, you can say, okay, that didn't work so well now. What do I need to do the next time? It's always that reevaluating and just continuing to move forward, just like you would in any kind of a self-help, even like with dieting. You don't want to just throw it out and say, I can't do it. You want to continue to practice that. I think it's just real. The other thing is that some of your students are coming to you and they don't have a support system. And that's really important to identify. I know with students that I've had from about fourth grade on, and I know this has worked really well even with my college students, is to say at the very beginning of class after we have a little trust issue that tell me something I need to know about them so I could be a better teacher. And if that means maybe they've had a closed brain injury or they have high anxiety or they're dyslexic or whatever, that they share that with me so that I have more understanding and don't make judgments that I shouldn't be making. That really has helped a lot. It helped me as a teacher, but you have to have also made sure that you've established some trust with students, because at-risk kids, they're not going to tell you any of those things, nor do I say should they, without you having established that trust. The other thing is you want to always let them know you don't want to be in control of them. You want them to help them be in better control of themselves. I think kids who have been abused are always afraid of someone being in control of them over and over again, and they're helpless.
Well, that would make a lot of sense when you're in those situations where you're not in control. You would really avoid that. You'd shut down. You'd fight to not be subjected to that kind of control, because it doesn't take you in a good place. But
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you have one more picture that I want to share, which is the last one, which is a picture of you and Tony together with your one of your dogs, or this. You can tell me which one this is, because I know you. When we talked earlier, you wanted to make sure that we end on a message of hope, and this was clearly a picture of the two of you, cool, successful, and hopeful. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, we're actually, Jan and I have both been to the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. several times, but this photo was taken at the last Memorial weekend in Fort Collins, and this is the Vietnam Traveling Wall. And Jan and I were there as speakers, and we did some book signing. But we're standing at the wall, and this is one of our labs. This is Hunter Bailey. He's my service dog. And we had two labs. Chase was our other lab, and unfortunately, with old age, we lost him last year, just prior to the spring of last year. So we right now we have the one lab. He's wonderful. We use him in a lot of our presentations. He travels around the country with us. He gets to go through TSA right with us. He lies at our feet on the flight, and he's better behaved than most people. So, and one reason he has such good behavior is I trained him.
We always want to leave people with, Betsy, is that there is so much beauty and so much goodness in this world, but sometimes you have to focus on that and try to change that picture of everything bad that's going on. Because if you look, we always look at count your blessings. There's so many good things, so many good people, so many wonderful opportunities, but so much beauty that not to lose hope. Just a sunset or a sunrise will give you a sense that there is a sense of something greater governing your life and goodness in yourselves.
And we talk so much about healing mind, body, and spirit. That's something that we can all embrace. But we think it's really important that we count our blessings, however you view that, because, when you're thankful for all of the good things in life, that tends to trump the downside. And when you can constantly reinforce your mind and your thought process with how blessed we are, then that in itself can have a tremendous impact on how you feel about yourself how you feel about, people around you and the rest of the world. And, back to the labs, I mean, Bailey is here with us right now. He's lying right beside us.
Bored.
So he's been part of this discussion. But I think he's a little bit bored. But I love training lab retrievers. I mean, they're just my dog, and I've always had labs, and they're smart and they're beautiful, and most pets fit into that same category. But he's wonderful, and we just love having him.
So we also practice gratitude. It sounds like the end of an Oprah show, but it really helps us is just to try and stay in a state of practicing gratitude, and when we do that, we're just a little bit calmer and feel better about our lives, and as we braver about going and facing the next moment or the next day.
And this photo we're looking at right now was taken at the Vietnam Memorial in Angel Fire, New Mexico. And I'm here. Jan took the picture. I'm here by a Huey Iroquois helicopters that we used in Vietnam. And it's just a picture that we snapped somewhat in remembrance of all of those who served during that era, but of course in all wars. And so this is just kind of a commemorative photo of my war experience and my life today.
Well, you have certainly taken us on a journey today, and the information has been wonderful. I think the suggestions can be helpful to lots and lots of folks. We have filled up all of our time, and it's just been wonderful. So I think, Sarah, I'm guessing we might have some questions that have come up along the way, and I believe that when Tony and Jan and I spoke earlier, they were willing to provide some answers after the fact. So I think what we will do is collect whatever questions have come in and try to provide some feedback to folks following the webinar. So
there is a question on whether the slides will be available.
Yes, we can make the slides available, and for anybody who is attending, we will be happy to email those. And I assume that's okay with you, Tony and Jan, with the pictures.
Sure.
Absolutely,
okay,
and I guess before we lose everyone, anyone who's interested in the book can go to our website, which is simply Tears of a Warrior. You can Google Tears of a Warrior, or it's just tearsofawarrior.com. But we have over 300,000 books now in VA hospitals and vet centers around the country, and many of those books, thousands of those books, have been donated by us and the Purple Heart Foundation. So anyone that's interested in the book, go to our website, get a hold of us. Whatever you might be interested in, I'm sure we can help support that.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful offer, and you've been so generous with your time and your information and your stories. So, Jan and Tony, I want to thank you so much for being part of this today and sharing your lives with us. I think I've learned a lot, and I imagine that everybody else who's on the webinar has as well. And thank you to those who are participating today. We appreciate your spending some time with us, and we hope you will join us on another Neuroscience in Education webinar sometime in the near future. Thanks again, Jan and Tony. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Betsy. We appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.